Welcome to the On-Target HTML5 website YouTube channel. The website is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll soon be adding a section on JavaScript, so I hope you visit us at www.ontargethtml5.com. All right, welcome to HTML5 Essential Training Series. In this tutorial, we're going to look at the Div Element Part 2. In the previous tutorial, we left off where we had formatted a few of our div elements, and we were going to complete the demonstration on using the div element and IDs to identify areas of our web page. Using div elements and unique IDs, we had identified sections of the web page. Adding the div elements to the page did not affect the appearance of the page until CSS formatting was added. If you remember right, by adding those div elements before we actually put any content in there, remember none of that stuff appeared in the browser window. So adding div elements to your page does not affect the appearance of the page at all, but it does affect document flow, which we'll talk about in a later tutorial. So then we continued with our demonstration and used CSS to format the container section, the header section, and the content section of our web page. For each div element that was added to the HTML structure, an ID attribute was added to give that element a unique ID, that div element a unique ID. These ID attributes were used as selectors in our CSS to apply the formatting to the contents of the div element. If you remember right, we added the div element to our HTML structure, then we added an ID and we gave that ID a name, a unique name, and then we had our closing tag for the div element. That unique ID name is how we actually identified in CSS what we were formatting. So, and then here's an important note that I really should have talked about during that part one of the tutorial, but I didn't. When you're using IDs on a web page, the ID must be unique for that page. What I mean by that is that on any one web page, we can only have one ID with the name of header. So in other words, if I've got a large web page, I've got a bunch of divs in there, I can only give one of those divs an ID of header. So one ID with the name of container, etc. I can't have multiple names of the same ID on a single web page. Now I can have those names on a different page, but each individual web page has to have unique IDs. You'll learn more about this as we progress through the tutorials, but it's an important concept to understand that ID attributes in HTML and HTML5 must be unique to the page. And again, when we get into the CSS tutorials, if you go through the CSS section, you'll hear me talk about that a lot, the difference between classes and IDs. We also incorporated a very simple CSS reset to set all of our browsers back to the settings of no margins and no paddings so that our page would appear the same in all the browser windows. Using what we've learned in HTML5 and CSS, let's go and complete that footer section of our web page. So let's go back and move back into our development environment and let's finish up what we started in part one of the tutorial. All right, so let's go ahead and minimize our presentation and bring up our development environment. First thing I want you to notice is I have created a Chapter 10 folder, the Development Part 2. Inside that folder, I've brought in my CSS folder, my images folder, and I've also created a new Chapter 9_03.html file, which you're going to see in a minute. That's where we're going to start this particular tutorial series. Also, I have my web server up and running with my MySQL and PHP. Everything is running as it should be, so we can go through the demonstrations. So at this time, let's go ahead and bring up our text editor. I want to go ahead and bring up my browser. This is where we left off in the previous tutorial. You'll notice I do have the Chapter 9_03.html file up and loaded. This would be a good time to pause the tutorial if you need to copy this if you don't already have it. Keep in mind, this is exactly where we left off in the previous tutorial, so you should be able to just bring that one into this folder and save it as Chapter 9_03, because there is nothing different. I've also brought in our main.css file, again, exactly as it was in the previous tutorial. We haven't made any changes yet. We're getting ready to add those now. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and finish up based on what we were just talking about. Let's go ahead and finish up doing our footer. I'm going to cover a couple of new things in the footer that we didn't discuss in the previous tutorial. But let's go ahead and finish formatting that using our Div Id Footer. Let's go into our main.css. If you have the example files, you'll be able to go to example number 2. If not, I'll give you time to go ahead and copy this. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this into my CSS file. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. You'll notice I'm using my ID of footer. I'm giving it a width, a height, and a background. And now would be a good time to go ahead and copy this if you need to. So let's go ahead and pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and save this file. I'm going to refresh my browser window, and you'll notice now we've added a width to the footer. We've actually given it a fixed height of 25 pixels and a light blue background color. So like the other sections of this particular HTML document, we've now separated out the footer from the rest of the content, and we've actually put that into the footer ID, which we're working with. One of the things I don't like, as we've talked about in the previous tutorial, is I don't like the fact that my text is all the way forced to that left-hand side. So again, using CSS and example number 3 in our example file, I'm going to go ahead and copy that line, and I'm going to add it to my CSS file, my text-align_center. I'm going to go ahead and save that document. If you need to go ahead and pause to type that in, go ahead. But that should center our text inside of our footer element. So when I refresh the page, you'll notice now the text has moved to the center of the document itself. And since the footer width is 100% of my container content, it will stay at the 500 pixels regardless of what I do when I start doing this resize, as we demonstrated earlier. So we're going to stay at that 100%. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover a couple things we didn't cover in the previous tutorial, a couple other settings that we can do in CSS. And one of those being is I want to actually give this text a different type of font. Normally your footer is of a smaller font, smaller text size, and we actually increase the line height a little bit so we can center it in that footer element. So I'm going to go ahead and take this information from example 4 in our example files folder, or exercise files, and I'm going to go ahead and paste this in to our footer ID inside our CSS document. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes, and now would be a good time to pause if you need to go ahead and type those changes into your document. When I refresh my browser, you'll notice now we've got a smaller text. We've actually given it a true text type, a font family, Times New Roman, Times Sans Serif. I've given it a font size of 0.8 and a line height of 2 And I know that you're probably not familiar with M or EM as a size. We actually use M's quite a bit when we're doing web page design. And I'm actually going to do a tutorial, a future tutorial on these different sizes, the differences between pixels and M's and X's, because there are some different sizes. And based on the type of website you're designing and whether or not it's responsive, a lot of times will determine what type of sizing elements you're going to use as you size things when you design your web pages. I do want you to get used to seeing the EM size element, because it is something that I use a lot when I'm designing web pages, because again, it can be responsive to the base font size. And we'll talk more about that as we get into more of our development. Okay, so now we've got this footer designed and developed. We formatted it just as we talked about. It's set up just like our other div elements. So we've addressed all 4 of the elements that we set up inside this HTML file. What I want to do in the next portion of the tutorial is let's talk about the HTML5 elements and the best elements to use for these particular items, because up to HTML4, div was the way to do this. This is the way that web designers did this. But with the implementation of HTML5, there's some better ways, there's some better elements to use to identify these sections of our website. And that's what we're going to cover next. All right, so our role began to change with the introduction of HTML5. HTML5 semantics. In our examples, we used the div elements to separate our web page structure into sections of the website. Up until HTML5, this was a very common practice, but it did have its drawbacks when it came to continuity in design. Let me explain what I mean. And during this discussion, keep in mind the importance of web access through screen readers and search engine optimization, because that's one of the main reasons why the semantics in HTML5 have begun to take a turn for a more direct approach to how we structure these pages. Before HTML5, div elements were used to define divisions within the body of an HTML document. This was very common and an accepted practice by the majority of web developers. Now that HTML5 has added semantic elements to the scripting language, many of the div elements can and should be replaced with those semantic elements. Let's imagine a screen reader reading through our document and trying to determine navigation or a page header information. Using div elements and looking through the web, I found the following names for header sections on a web page. I saw some headers that were called header, some were called head, some were called main 1, some were called masthead, some were called page top, and etc. So you can imagine a screen reader trying to go through there and pick out what the header elements for that particular page were, that web page. It can become very confusing. And screen readers are very popular for the visually impaired in order for them to use the web. So can you see where the confusion could come in and when trying to screen read the header section of a page? The same holds true for indexing our pages for search engine optimization and for navigation. Imagine a screen reader trying to read a navigation section of a web page when there's 40 or 50 different terms that web designers or web developers may use for the div tag to design a navigation section. So by developing a standard, the plan is that structured design will become more consistent and open up the web to many more users. And so that's what we're actually shooting for here. We're trying to get a much more structured design and the structural integrity of our web pages. The primary HTML5 semantic elements that we're going to be concerned with, especially during this tutorial, and keep in mind there are additional semantic elements, but these are the ones we're going to focus on during this tutorial, are header, which is the header for a page, section, which is a generic section of a document that does not indicate the type of content contained in the document, and don't let the definition confuse you. I mean, this is taken right out of the specifications guide. It's just a generic section of our document. It's a particular section where everything in that section pertains to the topic. Article is a composition similar to an article in a newspaper. Nav is a section of the page that contains links to other pages or navigation. Aside is a section of a page similar to a sidebar that's related to the content that it's near. In other words, the aside is normally related to an article or a section that it resides next to on the HTML page. And then the footer is for the actual footer of the page. The one thing I want to clarify is that you can have more than one footer on a web page. You can actually have a footer that's in a particular section or in a particular sidebar, and you can have a footer that's actually pertaining to the page. So there could be numerous footers on a web page, just as there could be numerous navigation sections on a web page. So let's go in and look at the page that we've been working with and make some corrections to the page based on the new semantics that are available in HTML5 so we can get that page more in line with an HTML5 document. Alright, so let's go back in. Let's go ahead and minimize our presentation. Let's open up our browser window. Go ahead and open up our text editor because we're going to be making some changes to our document. And we are going to implement the HTML5 semantic elements to make this document more compliant with the new HTML5 standards. So let's think about the semantic elements that we have available. And to do that, let's go ahead and look at our presentation one last time real quick and see what semantic elements are available for our document. Alright, let's jump back in our presentation real quick. If you remember, we've got a header, a section, an article, a nav, and a side, and a footer. So let's go back into our document real quick and look and see, okay, this first div ID we've got set up as container, and that contains the entire document itself. Remember that we gave it a yellow outline, or a yellow background, and a blue outline. So that's the entire document. We really don't have an HTML5 semantic element that makes that, or that would fit well in that particular area. So we're going to leave that div ID as container. But now for header, if you remember going back to our presentation, we actually do have a header element. So let's go ahead and remove this div, and let's change that div to a header, an actual header element. And remember, we've actually got to go down and change our closing div also. So we got the end of the header. Let's go on down here and change that closing div so it's a closing header div. Let's go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to do a save as. We're going to save this as 9_04 in your exercise files. Now would be a good time if you need to pause to type in these changes. Let's go ahead and save those changes, and I want to update my browser. And you're going to notice something happen when we update this browser. Let's go back in and load that 04 file. I'm going to go ahead and update the browser, and notice that we've lost the formatting that we had originally set up for our header. If you remember, we had to set our head up with a width of 80%, a background color, a height, but now it seems like we've lost all the formatting and all we have is the text. And if you think about what's happened here, remember we had an ID of header that actually included this header information. That ID no longer exists. But if we were to go back here to our CSS file and change this to a header tag, and then save that change, and actually I don't need those less than and greater than signs, save that change and update our browser, we get our formatting back. Because now what we've done is we've actually changed the identification of this formatting is no longer going to an ID, but it's actually going to a tag, the header tag, which is right there. So cool. So we've identified an HTML5 semantic element that we can use in place of that div. So let's look at the next area. The next area we have is content. And if we go back and look at our presentation, we really don't have anything that talks about content, but that content area is going to be a section of document content that pertains to one another. So we could actually make that a section element. And that's what I want to do. I want to go back into our div. Let's go ahead and remove that div and make this a section. And again, don't forget to put our closing tag, because with opening tags and closing tags, remember these are block level elements. We've got to tell it where that block begins and where that block ends. Now would be a good time to pause the video if you need to type that in. If you don't have availability to the exercise files, I'm going to go ahead and save this change, update my browser, and guess what? Just as with the header, remember with our CSS file, we no longer have an ID for a content area, but we actually do have a section tag. So we can go back into our CSS file, change this to section, make a save, update our browser, and we've got our section formatting back. And now again, we've also got, we're more in line with the standards for HTML5 semantics. And looking back at the presentation one more time, you notice that we have a footer area, or footer element, that's now available in HTML5. So let's go ahead and change our footer div ID to a footer element. Remember to put in our closing tag, save that change, update our browser, and again we've got to go back in our CSS, identify the footer itself, save the file change in CSS. If you need to go ahead and pause the video, go ahead. Go ahead and save all our changes, and let's refresh our browser window. And we've got everything back, but now we have a document that's much more HTML5 semantically correct. We actually have a header section. We have a section for our content. We actually have a footer. And those are following along the lines of the HTML5 semantic elements. So real quick, in the next tutorial, or in the next section of this tutorial, because I want to do one more thing really quick to answer some questions, because we discussed how we can have more than one section. Obviously, we're going to have more than one section in pages. We're going to have more than one footer sometimes in a page. So in the next portion of this tutorial, let's discuss how we handle that. All right, so we've covered a lot of information in this tutorial, but let me cover one thing real quick. So with the new HTML5 semantics, does it mean that we should never use div elements? And the quick answer is no. It doesn't mean that we should never use div elements, but what it does mean is that when we have content that more adequately fits inside the new HTML5 semantic elements, we should utilize those elements so that it helps with the indexing of our page, it helps with screen readers, and it helps with our SEO, or search engine optimization. As these pages are searched for indexing on the web, those new semantic elements will make them appear better in the search engines, because the page will be structured better in the indexing. One thing we talked about in the previous section of this tutorial, we talked about we could have multiple footers and multiple sections and multiple headers. But if we look at our CSS file, I mean, we've given these sectioning, I mean, we've given them identification as far as the section we know has got a light gray background. If I were to add another section, well, what if I don't want it to have that light gray background? Or what if I want it to appear in a different area? Or what if I want it to have different padding? Because we may want to do that. There are ways to handle that. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I want to save our chapter 4. I want to do a save as 04 section 5. And the same thing with our CSS file. I want to do a save as. And let's save this as main_1.css because we're going to make some changes to this, but I want you to be able to have both copies of this in the event you have access to the exercise files. So let's say that I have 2 sections inside my web document. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this section, and I'm going to come right below it, and I'm going to paste it into my web document. I'm going to do a save. Let's go back and refresh our browser window so we can load that new document. And you notice now we have 2 of these pre-Civil War sections, but I want this section, the second section, to have a different background color, or I want it to have rounded corners. So how will I do that? Remember that sections, like most other elements in HTML5, have attributes, and each one of these sections can have an ID, just like we were using ID with our div elements. I'm going to call this sec2, and I'm going to give our first section ID equals sec1. Got to remember to include those in quotes. Okay, now would be a great time to pause the video if you need to go ahead and get this information down. I'm going to go ahead and save these files. Keep in mind that our footers can have IDs and our header can have an ID. So all these attributes that belong to these tags in HTML5, just as they did in HTML4, we still have all the attributes available for these elements. And in a later tutorial, I'm going to show you where you can get all this information and what attributes are available for every element in HTML. But for right now, let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and save this as save as main_1. So now we've got our main CSS file saved. We've got this saved. I want to go up into my document. Remember, we're calling out this main CSS file, so I got to put _1 here also. So I call the right file, save those changes, refresh this in my browser, and nothing should have changed because I haven't changed anything yet. But let's go into my CSS file now and let's say, okay, let's go to this ID of sec2. So under my section elements, I'm going to come down here and say I've got an ID of sec2. And in that sec2, I want to have a background of, and we're just going to give it a, let's give it a deep yellow background. That's a good background to start out. I want to give this a width of 90%, so it's a little bit different than our previous one. I'm going to do something on this we haven't done before. Let's give it a border radius of 15 pixels, and what that does in CSS3, that actually rounds out these corners. So we're going to actually have some rounded corners on this. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give it this margin right, margin left, so we keep it centered on the page. I'm just going to go ahead and copy those from my section element, bring those down here. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. Now would be a good time to pause if you need to review this information. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my window. And you'll notice now we've picked up that new background color. We've picked up those rounded edges. We've actually picked up the decrease in width, because remember the section element was 95, now we're only 90, so it's a little bit narrower than our previous section element. And it's updated in our browser window. And all this information is available under example 6 and under example 7 of your exercise files in the event you have access to those exercise files. But you can see now that we've actually added, we gave section 2 an ID of sec2, went into the main CSS file and added some formatting for ID of sec2 or section 2 inside my CSS file. And one thing I do want to explain is because of the order in which this is running, because some people are going to say, well, wait a minute, why didn't this section take priority and just format this? Because it does have a section tag. And you're right, it does have a section tag, but because I've given it an ID, the ID takes priority over the generic tag in CSS. It's called an order of precedence, and there are some, and you're actually going to see as we move further along in the tutorials, there's actually an order of precedence in the way that styles are administered also. Because the way that we're using the external style sheet, that has an order of precedence also. If I were to put styles into my head section, they would take priority over this. And if I were to put inline styles into the actual element itself, which we can do, and you'll see that further along in the tutorials, those take priority over the style sheet and the styles that reside in the head section. So there's priorities as to how things are entered and how things are executed in the CSS sheets in the styling. But you'll notice now we do have additional styles based on that ID. I could actually go in here and make this ID sec1, because technically since I gave that an ID, if you remember correctly, we actually went in here and gave this an ID. This is the proper way to do this. Let's go ahead and save those changes. And now when I refresh, there should be no change at all in this section, other than the fact that I've lost a little bit of my spacing because of the way that I've got my formatting set up for my CSS Reset. But you'll see now that, again, my sec1 has its own spacing, sec2 has its own spacing. And because I have not given any height or any of that stuff to this section, see it's kind of collapsed on itself. As these were a section tag, I was assuming all the variables here and overriding the ones that I didn't use. Once that was gone and I went into the ID of this particular device, I was no longer doing section elements, but I went directly at the ID. I wasn't inheriting anything from this formatting in my section 2 formatting. And we'll get much more into that as we go further along in the tutorials, but I wanted you to see and understand that we can give IDs to these sections, so I can have multiple sections on a page, I can have multiple footers on a page, multiple navigation streams on a page, and so on. And we're going to cover much more of this as we go further in the tutorials, but I hope that this explains, one, some of the HTML5 semantic elements, and we're going to do a lot more on those, and two, how we use divs inside of our HTML development. I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available in the development environment. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting.